Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman auxiliary forces, and there is really a lot to say about these troops that made up, as we will be seeing now, actually the major part, numerically, of the Roman army, and they had a crucial role in it, so that they are a bit this forgotten presence in the face of the ideal picture in popular culture of the Roman Legionnaire, as if he was capable of doing all the work by himself. They definitely could. Roman legionaries were practically trained to achieve anything, but one thing is an individual soldier, one thing is moving up armies of tens of thousands and needing a specialization that is gonna be favorable to all involved except the enemy at this point. And today, I mean, there is a lot to tell about Roman auxiliaries, and definitely in the future I will talk in detail about them. Today I would like to make not really an introduction. Every once in a while I make video that says title plus an introduction. This doesn't really want to be an introduction itself, even if it will have some general it will have it has a name to outline broadly the whole picture, but it's mainly aimed at really explaining the role of auxiliaries, not just in the Roman army, because the Roman army is something so iconic that we need to think that auxiliary forces were kind of an exception, by saying, as if other armies didn't use this, and or as if the Romans needed to compensate. This is the myth that some people still own. I don't know why. That I don't know, that being weak in cavalry, they needed cavalry auxiliaries because that was the only one available. The whole thing is a bit more complicated, and I will try to show how actually the auxiliary forces in this sense could first of all represent a very wide range of troops, not just a light infantry. Some auxiliaries were de facto as effective as Roman legionnaires, and sometimes equipped just with the same weapons. This is also something that has to be weapons and armor. Another myth we have to debunk is that the auxiliaries were lighter than legionnaires. I mean, yeah, I'm sure some of them, most of them arguably were, but others were really equipped even with the same legionary armor, and this is nothing to be surprised of. But more generally speaking, we will see how it wasn't really the Romans who needed auxiliaries as such, but how the whole military of the ancient world was de facto made up of either of armies that were really put together from with every kind of troops available, and exclusively of those. I mean, but let's clarify the concept, naming first the others, like armies like the Roman ones, or the Hellenistic ones, or at least the major Hellenistic powers, definitely had a professional, permanent military, like the phalangites or the Roman legionnaires, and then auxiliaries. But if you look at the rest of the world, of these so-called barbarians, that obviously we are just using as a comprehensive term, not really to despise them as such, actually didn't have a centralized governments, or at least their governments were kind of tribal entities that really came as coalition on the battlefield. And in that perspective, you can see, you can argue that in proportion it's as if those troops had all been made up of the same level of the so-called auxilia of the Roman army, in proportion, because they were usually people who didn't live off of war as mercenaries, and at least not the majority. These were still tribal levies that might have been skilled into war, especially small-scale raids and all. And they're definitely effective in that context, exactly because they eventually would have been used as auxiliaries by the Romans as well. But really, because these troops were kind of um, unprofessional troops and brought in initially just as troops that had to fill the gaps in a certain way. And and we can see from the tactics of the tribal peoples that this was pretty much the norm, in the sense that war was something very difficult to wage at a strategical scale for these powers. They had limited resources, poor logistical means. Just certain peoples that had a greater cohesion on a national, we can't say national from in the Roman sense of the word, on a national level, had a better military, but also in there there were inherent inherent faults, that were structural and related to the lack of centralization, that couldn't make these sometimes very exceptional warriors effective. And the Romans, as other civilizations, with permanent army, permanent professional troops, drew heavily from these populations exactly because they were more warlike. They hadn't exhausted their their warrior lifestyle, and therefore they could be framed into the Roman military machine, and therefore associating their warlike attitude with discipline, which is something that takes a little while to eventually to turn out right, and that however does make brilliant efforts. And this is also another concept that you have to remember when thinking about the Roman military, is that the Romans weren't born as disciplined soldiers. They were italic warriors who had a very few discipline, we can say, and that therefore were quite similar originally to the same, eventually to the same warlike auxiliaries that, say, in early imperial times were enrolled into the Roman ranks. So this is very important because as a concept to start from the origin of the of this institution, because if you look at how Rome rose to power into Italy and eventually the Mediterranean, you notice that the organization of the Roman legion actually was born, let's say, compensating, or at least not having a big need of auxiliaries in some forms. I explain myself better. Of course, the greatest part of the Roman armies, even in Republican times, say during the Punic War, but even before, at the time of the Latin Wars, did have allies, and very large amounts of them. But what is really important here is to look more at not much at the juridical status of these troops, but at their tactical role. I mean, if you take the early Roman legion, you notice that there were there was a social segmentation that was reflected into the classes of recruitment that made up the Roman legion. And the very early classes included troops that could range from elite heavy infantry to essentially skirmishers. If you look at the Polybian Roman army, but even at the Camillian one, the one before, ever since the classes were instituted, you see that the velites, so these light troops that had a skirmishing role, so really they were not really even framed into ranks. They had scatter information. They were this kind of troops used for dirty job, essentially, as the auxiliaries would have become eventually, even if they eventually evolved even in something more consistent than scattered skirmishers, were Roman citizens. I mean, differently from the Hellenistic world, into which the psiloi, or this light infantry was skirmish infantry, was made up by slaves. Also in the early hoplitic armies that definitely had this kind of light sometimes even just robbers or brigands associated to them, and operating and just throwing javelins, and obviously just maybe softening up the enemy ranks, but not being able by themselves to take out the enemy armies, were slaves, and were not framed into the citizen system. So originally speaking, the Romans had pretty much every tactical unit that was needed to serve in their own in every tactical and strategic scenario. So why is that the Romans eventually began to use auxilia in this sense? Well, the idea is obviously to look at Roman society and politics as well, but there is a much more evident side of this. I mean, if the Romans rising during the Punic Wars into Italy and beyond, eventually into the Mediterranean, were essentially already heavy infantry. Even if this is the time of the so-called triplex acies that had still a certain kind of segmentation with the astati that were lighter than the principes that were heavier, and eventually the triarii were this kind of almost elite spearmen units. What you see is that over time, especially when warfare began to pass from seasonal to professional, especially during the Second Punic War, when these Italic legionnaires had to spend literally years outside of home, and therefore being completely equipped by the state already at this time, much before the Marian reform, because they might have even as well at that time come from home with their own weapons, but if they stayed like with Scipio in Spain for years, and they had at least you don't have to think that it would provide their equipment by themselves. It would be much more efficient to have a military organization and logistics that was essentially in the hands of the consuls of the Roman commander. So what it began to happen is that this heavy infantry was beginning to become something very costly, but also very effective, and especially what is a kind of infantry was theoretically still made up of Roman citizens. I mean, not theoretically but by de facto, but also by the Soci, the Italic allies that, as far as we know, were equipped in the same fashion of the Roman citizens, the full Roman citizens, especially at this time. So no difference at all, tactically speaking. Well, they had a political weight. I mean, back into Italy, these populations, I mean, Rome had expanded over these troops, over these peoples, and had basically obliged them to serve into the Roman legions, so that there were even more Italian allies than strictly Roman citizens at this point. But they were surely troops that didn't want to be thrown away. At this time, warfare starts to become something very serious. There is, especially during the 2nd century BC, the crisis of recruitment, for which basically was increasingly difficult for Rome to recruit troops, at least with the traditional means. So it was obvious that the Roman citizen or the Italian ally joined the army with a certain expectation to be a kind of I can't say an elite troop, but a trooper, but someone that at least the Roman state cared on to be effective into battle. Because if they had just thrown them into battle as skirmishers, as regular, as light troops that were to do all the dirty job, that they might have even Rome might have even met with more opposition from the Italics. So the idea of joining the Roman legions was definitely something dreadful at this time, considering the situation, also internationally speaking. But at least it could, at least for someone, it could be a way to make a living for. So in order to absorb the difficulties of people who didn't want to be recruited, also because they were beginning to lose their own the capability of keeping themselves in practice. The Romans were transitioning from a militia of amateurs into a professional army that was paid by the state, and that could offer, therefore, a salary, or at least a way to survive for those who joined. And this is when Marius arrived and formalized the system and basically created this unique Legionnaire based on the equipment of the old Principes, that was the more balanced and effective and versatile one. So at this time, making making Italians, because they were starting to become Romans, by the way, because the citizenship was progressively spreading into Italy, had equated to give them this kind of leading role as legionnaires, and which was very expensive but very effective, as we were saying, and therefore having Rome expanded so fast, so much into the Mediterranean, why spending money to have troops that have just to do skirmishing or cavalry scouting operations and stuff like that, or if you have already into the Mediterranean lots of barbaric, we can say, troops that are, however, already very skilled, and they're very cheap, and you can buy them and not spending a lot of money to equip with, and that are pretty effective into battle as for all the, let's say, preparatory phases of the battle, into which eventually the heavy legionnaires would have been thrown in at the apex of the fight. So it's not that the Romans. It is true that the Romans lacked at that point certain classes. Like, for instance, if you take Roman cavalry, it's obvious that Italy had not produced social classes that had a great equestrian tradition. Indeed, actually, the Roman cavalry remained always formidable. Very few people know that the Romans actually had very strong cavalry, and the prejudice that it was weak only comes from the fact that the Romans had a few of this cavalry. But if you really look at when the Romans fought against other enemies, they never lost a single battle in condition of cavalry battle in condition of numerical when the enemy numbers were equal to the Roman ones. And especially they had very skilled military cavalry commanders. So the idea why, at this point of recruiting cavalry in societies that normally were already using cavalry on a regular base in their warfare seemed obvious. I mean, Roman Numidian cavalry was basically all there into the 2nd century BC and even beyond, into the Roman armies, because the Numidians were great cavalrymen, were cheap. The Romans were at least initially in good relations with them. They had won even the Carthaginians in Africa thanks to their help. And obviously these aristocrats, Numidian aristocrats with their own retinues of light horse skirmishers, were quite happy to join the Roman army and to receive benefits and to remain at the top of their own society thanks to the Roman backing. So it was very interconnected, but it was extremely cheap, because how could the Romans at that point spend money for training a cavalry like the Numidian one? I mean, the Numidians were already there. Just pay them. They're gonna be much cheaper than any other weird experiment of of Italian cavalry forced to to train like in a Numidian fashion that was already present, was always traditionally there into North Africa, and just use it. So this is how it really happened. It's not that the Romans really lacked the means to field certain specialties. It's just that it was economically more convenient to draw them from other peoples, and this is true from basically every other army in history. If you look at how auxiliaries, how mercenaries, how you want to call them, contractors or whatever, are hired, it is essentially to carry for the sake of economy. That it can be also political economy in the sense that, as I was saying, making Italians die into Spain, for instance, was something dangerous inherently for the same the same um, gluing of the Roman dominions together. And the Romans basically did that because at a certain point their aristocracies were so strong that they could abuse of the local populations. The Italic aristocracies were the same ones that for making career in Rome sent their own connationals to die in the most remote corners of the world for Rome. But in general, it was a matter of, especially of material costs that obviously could be translated into political ones, for which at a certain point the Roman legionnaires eventually even stopped being prevalently Italian, but they are starting to be raised elsewhere, like in Gaul, into Syria, because the Italians didn't want to do that anymore. They could simply pay for financing other people going to fight for them, and this is how really the whole thing the whole populations of the empire at one point during the late Roman times weren't much good for warriors, because under the Roman domination had kind of civilized and they didn't want to fight anymore. It's not a surprise, for instance, that the 3rd century emperors were largely coming from Illyria, raising from the military, because Illyria was one of the most primitive areas of the empire that had not yet lost the warlike character that it retained since the tribal times. So these are the real reasons for which the Romans needed other troops, aside from saying, oh well, but the Romans were weak in cavalry. If the Romans had been a different society, even in Italy, that wasn't much good for, or better, extremely good for cavalry, because Italy had actually some good cavalry, but too few in number. It could have kept fielding cavalry in some measure. As a matter of fact, we know that the Italics actually gave to the Roman legions quite substantial and strong military contingents. The famous alae, or ale, that were among certain populations from Apulia or Campania. There were strong cavalries, because maybe society there was a bit more stratified, and therefore it was an aristocracy at the top that could afford to fight on horseback. That is always something expensive. But hey, at a certain point we have the Numidians, we have the Moors, we have the Gauls, we have we have the Cantabrians. We have troops that are good at fighting on horseback and just want to make a career into our ranks to maybe gain the Roman citizenship, and they're cheap to hire. Let's hire those. Quite simple, quite logical, I'd say. And I must say that since the beginning, however, because we were starting from the beginning, I must say that the Roman allies, because the Auxiliaries were usually the name that eventually was given into the Principate, and eventually names changed, but in practice the relation was always the same. These were kind of Roman clients that gave their their troops to Rome to fight alongside their legionnaires. So when you look at the italics, you see that what they could field was heavy infantry, just like the Legionary one, was cavalry, was skirmishers, was all troops that essentially could work as auxiliaries. So sometimes we picture auxiliaries like just the ones who were eventually institutionalized by Augustus with the cohortes and the ally. But in practice, this had really never changed. What happened at that point was that these corps were kind of institutionalized into the army as administrative entities on their own, and tactical entities on their own. But in practice, what the Romans kept doing, even after that system eventually faded, was continuing to hire troops from other peoples. And I repeat, this was completely normal for any other army of the ancient world. So nothing to be really surprised by. We can be fascinated by the fact that obviously the Romans stretching their rule over such faraway lands had such a diverse pool of auxiliary troops that in this sense were selected on the base of their effective capabilities. Like the Mauryan cavalry seems to have been like the best horse riders that the Romans could field at a certain point, or the Cretan archers. These peoples that basically made up of their military traditions a fortune into the Roman Empire. And it is very interesting how even these populations, as I was saying before, eventually lost part of their individual skills. For instance, relatively to slingers, it seems that from a certain time on during the Empire, slingers were quite prominently as, or at least quite widespread as auxiliaries in the Roman army. At a certain point, kind of disappear from the sources, which could have happened as well for our because we lost some sources. But seemingly, people have argued that this could have as well happened for the fact that when these slingers, or as well as any other specialist troop, had joined in the Principate the auxiliary troops, and eventually gone to live in another place and changing his life and settling down in another country, he eventually even lost that that military tradition he was good at, because maybe his son wouldn't know anything about that, differently from having lived in a society like of shepherds to which everyone was able to use the sling. And if you became a Roman citizen who walked had his life walking in the Forum, taking baths into the Thermae, you would have not known anything about. So these are all considerations relatively to how the organizational phase passed from. Then even relatively to the skirmishing and the need of having, relatively to tactical problems, the point of needing troops that could operate in certain terrains into which the legionnaires would have been a bit handicapped, is another valid reason, because light troops were definitely used to be thrown away into these difficult terrains into which a lot of guerrilla ambushes and stuff were going on. So it was an attrition warfare. You necessarily had to throw in troops that you had not spent a lot of money for training and for equipping, and for seeing them butchered and not even having expressed their full tactical potential yet. and these troops were really present everywhere. I mean, everywhere you went in the ancient world, you could find these extremely light troops, cheap ones that you could use for all the needs that you needed, even logistical ones, even as sappers, as pioneers, even though the Roman legionnaires were pretty much effective on their own in this sense. But hey, maybe let's make the legionary rest if you have other people who can carry out the job and save energies for later fight, for instance. And this has been the logics that really underlines that is present at the idea of the same auxilia, is that the legionnaires were becoming something increasingly more elite, increasingly conceived to fight just into certain conditions, like especially when there were great masses of enemies that were channeled into the open field, into a pitched battle, and that the legionnaires could simply mop up and destroy frontally in their best tactics, or in sieges as well, because the Romans made, in the sense, at close combat, the legionnaire was pretty good as well, even though we shouldn't stress that too much, in the sense that it is true that the Roman legionnaire could adapt to every situation in terms of equipment of and tactical role, but even certain urban fighting was pretty risky, ambushes and stuff, especially these legionnaires being heavily armored, sometimes, or however, being not so agile, so you wouldn't really throw them into needlessly into ambushes and stuff like that, even in city centers. But the idea is that the legion was something that had to really smash as a mass force against another mass of enemies that was considerably softer in this sense, and concentrated. For all other operations, you would have not liked, as a Roman commander, to throw your legionnaires away, and you would have entrusted those operations to other people. So even there was also another problem relatively to slingers and archers, that I mean, seemingly Roman legionnaires, and we have proof of this, that they could be good slingers as well in certain occasions, which tells you, by the way, how, especially in late Republican times, where certain Roman legionnaires were coming from populations that had been recently Romanized, like the Cisalpine Gauls, and that probably had retained some kind of skill in tribal warfare, maybe could adapt into this sense. But even more civilized Romans could have as well learned how to use a bow or sling into their military during their military service. But in this sense, you can't use, as we were saying before, a fighter that is being trained to be a heavy infantryman, essentially. If you can have someone to be an archer or a slinger, if you have someone who is much better than him at archery and slinging, and that even costs much less. So what we notice, especially from the Marian Reform onwards, is the spread of long-range missile troops into the Roman legions. Seemingly, the Balearic slingers were, or the Cretan archers were the best for this. Some of them even began to be attached to the organics of the same Roman legions. I mean, not like bodies of auxiliaries, but of troops attached to the legionary to the legion, let's say, better. And we know that definitely Julius Caesar used Balearic slingers as well as Numidian cavalry into into Gaul, and these were kind of considerably, we can say, elite units, not in the sense that they were elite from in terms of because they were extremely costly. Probably as mercenaries they would have costed Rome something, but probably they were costs that definitely were worth of the pain. But they were elite in the sense that they were probably present in the world in relatively small numbers. I mean, even here, the sling or the bow was something spread basically in all Mediterranean and European societies, but still there were evidently large differences. If the Rhodian slingers are so, or the Balearic ones are so famous, or the Cretan archers are so famous, probably it was more than just availability. Maybe it was really about quality. And there weren't many, also because they were drawn from communities like, I mean, Rhodes, Crete, the Balearic Islands. I mean, they're not big places, so there is not many of them you can draw, and you try to kind of to save them, not to send them really into the avant-garde like a normal skirmisher, but maybe putting them even into pitched battle close to legionnaires to kind of inflict heavy damage, especially the slingers with their stones against the few armored elites that usually made up the barbarian armies. So let's say that the greater numbers at this point were troops that were kind of this halfway between melee infantry and javeliners. So with usually armored with spears that in this sense could serve as both, like throwing javelins and as normal arrest spear, which is ironically what actually the same Italic warriors were at the beginning, but that was in practically actually the average trooper in the world world at that time. I mean, we kind of think of the ancient world sometimes just about the Romans and the Macedonians, with these guys who had this particular kind of equipment, but the majority of the peoples were actually fielding troops that were this halfway between hit and run tactics and occasionally melee that could throw their spears as well as engaging the enemy hand to hand with them. And if you look at the same Roman legionnaire, he is actually a reminiscence of this thing, in the sense that the Italic warrior was a guy who fought with a shield, a very few armor, a helmet, and a javelin, and it is essentially the same that the Roman legionnaire actually became, aside from the increasingly heavier, especially armor gear. And in this sense, I think that the key of the Roman success was the ability of integrating such large numbers of auxiliary troops into their army. So something that the Greeks would have never liked, because they were distrustful of strangers, they had their own ideal of citizenship and all. The Romans instead were not so posh. They were aware of having been warriors themselves one day, and they found out, politically speaking, the way, and military speaking, the way to basically absorb the forces of other tribal peoples by subjugating them, but also letting them have their share into the Roman political matters, and therefore continuously giving this amount of medium troops that eventually could be even transformed into Roman legionnaires, which in this sense didn't take an excessive much. That at least at the time of Second Punic War, at least Rome had this full ability as a central government to impose a rigid discipline and to really um, oblige um, these warriors to bend to discipline, and therefore effectively combining discipline with individual skills, which was the secret of the Roman Legionnaire, as not just as an individual, but as a collective, but also as an individual fighter, because this is also a concept that is overlooked, as if like the Roman Legionnaire was able just to fight into a collective formation. Well, yes, usually, at least in the more in later times when Rome was like this, like in the early empire, indeed, a Roman Legionnaire wasn't this kind of savage taken from the tribal world. Usually, he was so when he was an auxiliary. Then eventually, in order to become a Roman legionnaire, that time you had to come from contexts that were a bit more civilized. But so in that case, maybe yeah, the average Celtic or Germanic warrior would have been superior individually to the Roman legionnaire, and obviously the Roman legionnaire would have simply beaten them with collective training and discipline that those warriors lacked. But the Roman legionnaire is a type of soldier that really has and retains, even through the centuries, a kind of an individual minded attitude to war. He's not really lost without formation. He's still resourceful enough to get into a fight if he's properly armed, as Polybius says. Um, and which is showed. I mean, the flexibility of the Roman legionnaires in this sense is astonishing. They could be the proper definition to define a Roman legionnaire is an assault engineer. It's not even a melee fighter. It's an assault engineer. I mean, these were troops who could fight as well as in orderly formation, and as a sapper under fire, as as an individual fighter and all. So and the Romans in this sense retained always this concept of the legionnaire. You can argue that even during the second, the third, even in fourth centuries, there has always been, in spite of a general kind of stratification in the Roman army, into which the legionnaires did always less compared to the auxiliaries, still the core idea that the Romans never lost, that the legionnaire theoretically had to be trained in a way that could really make him adaptable to any situation. And this is definitely true, especially in the late Roman times. You see that the Roman legionnaires were probably trained in two things that at the time of Augustus they would have never believed of, like being trained for years and years for all different weapons. In this sense, the late Roman legionnaire was a much more versatile fighter than the older and more iconic Augustan one. So relatively to this concept, we know that at the beginning of the 1st century AD there was a sort of reorganization of the Roman military that actually predates even the same century. It happened essentially as a process. It started at least from the end of the civil wars, when the Romans had been in arms in huge numbers, but still had in service lots of auxiliaries with whom they didn't really want to give away, because they had been fighting with they had fought into the Roman army. They were extremely skilled, extremely faithful. They came from populations that Romans wanted to keep close to them. So basically Augustus reorganized the Roman army by formalizing the existence of these auxiliary units as permanent units, just like the legions had become at that point. So we know famously the difference between the cohortes, the ally, and the cohortes equitatae, which basically means that the cohortes were usually infantry. mm, So they could be either spearmen or even archers and all. Then the ally were cavalry, and the cohortes equitatae or equitate were essentially mixed troops. Mm. I don't really know much about the organics of the cohortes and the ally, in the sense that I suspect that there was always a certain degree of interchangeability between infantry and cavalry, because especially among among the populations into which these troops were raised, the whole thing was evident. I mean, like if you take the Celts or the Germans, it was guys who were kind of used to fight indifferently on horseback and on foot. Maybe the Germans a little less, but generally speaking, the warriors were quite multitask in tribal societies. So they had certain individual abilities that, in that sense, probably the legionnaires couldn't arrive to at a certain point. And from this moment on, the auxiliaries become effectively sort of parallel Roman army, in the sense that they, not that there were two split things, but they basically become the you know, um, uh, we can say the equivalent of the legions in some ways, because yeah, we know the auxiliaries were not organized in the fashion of the legions, were much larger, etc., but they became constantly integrated with them. And the major and why I'm saying that they kind of rose to the same, almost to the same honors of the legion, is that these auxiliary units, into which these foreigners made a career in order eventually to gain a Roman citizenship, were used much more frequently than the Roman legions in actual combat. Even very big battles, sometimes pitched ones, not just skirmishing or scouting and all, or guerrilla, were basically carried won by auxiliaries only, while the legionnaires were like in the rear and looking how the thing was going. So you can imagine how, I mean, the Roman legionnaire was just extremely effective combat force. Then these auxiliaries had probably even more battle combat experience than them, in this sense, on average. It's a bit of a speculative consideration, in the sense that when you are on campaign, eventually you all fight probably in the same measure. But ideally speaking, as we were saying before, the Roman commanders preferred to spare the auxiliaries first, and then to commit the heavy and precious legionnaires. And this naturally meant that from a tactical point of view, that the auxiliaries were at a certain point kept in the same fashion of Roman legionnaires, because the stereotype wants that the Roman legionnaires had the gladius, the squared shield, and the famous and never called in this way at the time, lorica, the segmented armor, let's say, and all. And that instead the auxiliary was just a guy with a chainmail, like this wicker, right, and the oval shield and the spear. Well, telling the truth, this is completely ideal. Actually, yeah, legionnaires were a bit more standardized, probably, in the sense that they were an homogeneous troop conceived as that type of heavy infantry with heavy javelin, shield, and all. But and the auxiliaries were drawn from even from different specialties. Some would be really different from the legionnaires in actual fact, in terms of tactical specialization. But in terms of armor and of weapons and armors, the auxiliaries had really the same armors of legionnaires. Why couldn't an auxiliary use escort lorica segmentata for a fight if he had a chance? He would obviously be allowed to use that, as well as he could have used a gladius or a pilum or any other weapon that was available into the Roman army. And do not think that being equipped with a spear is something so inferior to the gladius or the pilum, because as a matter of fact, spears are pretty effective weapons that are even superior in most combat situations to a guy to a sword, essentially. So just for saying at this point that the legionnaires and the auxiliaries were thought as a combined force to be used effectively in this sense. Maybe the auxiliaries being used essentially to stop the enemy assaults, to absorb the main enemy energies, and eventually let the legionnaires doing the easy job of simply exterminating what was left. And this was done. In practice, those weren't gentle times. The Romans didn't, like any other people in the ancient world, didn't make them too many problems when they needed to exterminate for the sake of their own gains. So killing was a regular business, and that's what a soldier basically does. It's pretty naive to think otherwise, and it's the only reason why he's there. Naturally, in order to kill effectively, you have also to have a lot of other abilities that in this sense make the difference between a warrior and a professional soldier. Better say an average tribesman and a professional soldier. And there is one thing to say, however, relative to this, that when we talk about these things, we're talking still about certain, in a certain measure, at a theoretical level, in the sense that the Roman legions were thought, independently from auxiliaries, to be kind of self-sufficient. And the same legionnaires, in case of need, could transform themselves into light infantry to carry out scouting or skirmishing operations. You say legionnaires? Yes, why not? In war, really things go always in a way you cannot foresee. So you have to be necessarily trained to cope with those situations, and therefore legionnaires did that. But even for very elementary things, like if they had to march longer, to take all the extremely long marches that Julius Caesar made his soldiers perform, he didn't take with himself the whole army. He took an elite of troops that was, however, much more lightly loaded than the rest of the legionnaires. Maybe even leaving supplies and all. We have this idea of the Roman legionnaire as trained, which is definitely correct. Extremely heavily trained, carrying extremely heavily load on their backs. It is true, they were all trained in that fashion, up to 40 kilos on your back. And just think of what it means in practice. But it's not that they would stay there all the time. If you are in a combat situation to which you have to be combat ready and all, you don't stay with 40 kilos on your back. If you have carts, you will place your gear in there, and that's simple practice. Being trained to do that is one thing. Having the possibility of not doing it when you have to save energies, it's another obvious fact. So it's very easy to see even Roman legionnaires to perform tasks that ideally only auxiliaries would have been preferred to carry out. And this tells you, by the way, that how the Roman legion was still the core of the Roman forces. Like, if the Romans ever had a comprehensive management of their own military resources, which was not the case because things were much more decentralized than we commonly thought, because the Roman Empire is not a 19th century nation state. So sorry for some to hear this, but I mean, every provincial governor would kind of use his forces his own way, largely. But what I mean is that the Romans, however, still reason in terms of legions, not of number of auxiliaries. The auxiliaries could definitely help, because that's what auxilium means, but they were still conceived as an integrative force and not really like the core one that still the legionary had to embody. But the great difference in this sense from other empires is that the Romans, when needing to wage war on a grand scale, already had not random troops hired at the last moment just to make mass and to carry out skirmishing scouting operations, but highly qualified personnel made up by auxiliaries that were essentially specialized in doing that, were faithful, they had reasons to remain in the Roman army, and that especially were already trained to act in concert with the legions. So this is the great difference. And relatively to this, however, we should mention that as other many great Roman achievements, not just in military affairs but also in civil ones, is that it's not that the Romans were intelligent and the other were stupid. The Romans were capable of doing this at a point because they had the resources to do that. Like, the Augustan Empire was something that nobody had ever seen in terms of wealth, of sheer wealth. So training auxiliaries, giving them barracks, forts, training, supplies, is something that costs a lot. So if others didn't do that in history, at least in the West, or that in ancient times, you don't have to see that as, oh, the Romans were so superior to everyone. No, it's just that in that moment they had resources to do so, and also others would have done that. The problem being, however, also political and cultural, broadly meant, in the sense that I think that the key to understand the auxiliaries is really understanding how the Romans were unique in this sense, in the way and they integrated other elements into their own society, external elements, which other peoples didn't do, because even the major Hellenistic powers like the Seleucids or the Egyptians actually had either they didn't do that or they had trouble because they didn't want to do it in practice, because it was a completely different cultural background from the Roman one. But in general, I mean, what the Romans did before the formalization of the auxiliaries in Augustan times is that is what everybody had done. There were client states that gave them troops and they used them. So this is what also Hellenistic states did. So it's just when you think about Roman auxiliaries, you don't really have to ask why they did so, why the Romans enrolled these troops, because it was really the average of any other army at the time. And there is maybe a consideration that can be done to a certain extent to a certain extent to conclude on the late Roman times. What did auxiliaries came to be in late Roman times? Well, late Roman times, the main problem is that auxiliaries, as I was saying before, had kind of lost their military traditions that made them such effective specialist forces. From the beginning of the 3rd century, basically everyone who can speak or understand Latin in the Roman army is a Roman citizen. So you don't have any more those. Obviously, the Roman Empire was multi-ethnical, but mm, the population, the different populations that lived within the boundaries of the empire were at that point substantially Romanized, because Romans had kind of stopped um, big military expansion from the the beginning of the second century. There were major areas of of expansion, in the sense that there were enemies that at a certain point begin to consolidate, and the Romans would wage war in those regions. But the idea of overinflating was definitely present, and the Romans were already very reasonably quite satisfied with what they had already achieved and what they could control. They had basically conquered the world. Point. Don't consider the Roman borders as something exclusive, because what you find in the Roman borders is not just meant to control the people who live within the Roman boundaries, but also the ones that are outside. Like the let's say the limes on the Rhine. It's not that it controlled just the Germans. I mean, it definitely controlled the Germans. Even if the Romans were not settled into Germany, they kept them at bay as much as they did with the Gallic populations. Some of these peoples weren't even properly Romanized. There were Sacs of, like in Brittany or in certain parts of Britain or northern Spain, just to make a couple of examples, that were quite likely Romanized, and they hadn't essentially, but there were still small societies. I mean, there weren't peoples that were so still warlike or capable of grand military uh, exploit. I mean, they were subjugated by the Romans from centuries, and yeah, they probably didn't even need to serve in the army to achieve anything at that point. So what you had in the late Roman Empire is that the Romans kind of lost the material for including other peoples, because they had already been everyone had been included at that point. They all had become Roman citizens. So the answer, in a certain sense, there was obviously always the enrolling of external troops, especially in later Roman times. The barbarian federati are kind of the best examples. These were something slightly different, because eventually they became sort of political entity on their own. But it was still normal that anyone could come into the empire to serve in its military. But what the Romans tend to do, however, because they recognized that in this sense they were kind of over-reliant of someone who was outside of their borders and their administration, was to eventually multi-specialize their own infantry. And this is what I was talking about before. Like the Roman Legionnaire of the late Roman Empire is something that basically can start to be trained to do many things, including shooting with a bow, or with plumbate, or with other weapons, so that it becomes kind of a melee fighter, but it can perform a long-range missile fire, for instance. So just to say that people think that late Roman legions were kind of worse than the one who came before, but they haven't understood anything. Today in historiography it's definitely certain that especially 4th century legion it was something much more effective in terms of sheer damage that it could cause to the enemy than an Augustan legion. So in this sense, eventually the Byzantine, if we can call it this way, era is increasingly characterized by this, and this is something that lives on especially until the 6th century, when eventually there is a major breakdown of the whole Western civilization because of the plague, because of also in the East into Asia it happened the same. So eventually the whole thing collapsed. But even in further military Byzantine developments, what you see is this kind of being able to perform any kind of task, which still requires a lot of resources indeed. So this is not surprise why in the darker centuries even military quality kind of drops in some fashion. But the Eastern Romans definitely maintained this idea of being self-reliant, essentially, of not really needing other people's, if not as something that you can turn one against the other, because at that point weren't much more controllable. Even demographic balance was in not really in favor of the Romans anymore. So in this sense, the Eastern Romans became much more cautious in accepting the external elements, although it still did it extensively. But at the same time, it kept very clear in mind that the best thing was to have an army, a Roman army that could still perform everything in practice when needed on its own. So this is more or less what I wanted to say today, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I will keep doing videos on the Roman army because I noticed that many people are interested much more than on medieval warfare. Shame, because medieval warfare is beautiful. But you know, I'm here on YouTube to get views in practice, so I love the Roman army, as you probably understood, and as well. So why not throwing something about it every once in a while? And I hope everything was clear. If you have any question, please feel free to ask. Naturally, if you like this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further contents through notification. For now, I just thank you heartily, as always, for listening to me so patiently. If you had the strengths to listen to me for more than 1 hour. And as always, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.